This episode of Mudprints Unboxes was made possible by Hyperkin. Mouse technology sure has come a long way from the days of rollerballs and mousepads, especially in the case of vintage game consoles. The Super NES is definitely no exception. In today's Mudprints Unboxes, we take a look at the Hyperkin Hyperclick for the Super NES. There have definitely been times that I've wanted to fire up Mario Paint to take a trip down memory lane. I spent hours and hours and hours coloring, animating, composing music, and swatting flies. It's dreadfully archaic nowadays, but there are all kinds of other games that support the mouse as well. Over 40 in fact. The Super NES mouse has not exactly aged gracefully though. Enter the Hyperkin Hyperclick, a new corded optical mouse that aims to fix the inherent problems classic SNES mice have. Let's take a closer look. The Hyperclick's packaging harkens back to the original Super NES boxes that games and accessories were packaged in when the system was new. With a black and dark gray motif accented by red lettering and orange accents, the Hyperclick's box definitely looks like it would be right at home on shelves in the early 90s. Of course, the top corner is also sheared in typical Hyperkin fashion. The box opens up by pulling out a small tab and lifting the top part of the box. A few flaps later, the interior plastic tray can be seen and the Hyperclick can be removed. Interestingly, there were no instructions of any kind in the box. We thought this was a little odd, but after conferring with other Press Pause staff, we confirmed that they didn't have any in their box either. It's odd for reasons that we'll get into shortly. The Hyperclick itself is considerably larger than the Super NES mouse, which is great because my hands in specific are way bigger now than they were when I was 10. This gives the Hyperclick a good amount of volume to better grip and manipulate it. It's also sufficiently weighty, making for a mouse that doesn't feel cheap. It feels adequately substantial overall, something that a lot of aftermarket controllers for older systems in particular don't quite achieve. Sporting purple buttons with solid micro switches and a similar color scheme to the original Super NES, when it was new of course, the Hyperclick definitely falls right in line with other Super NES accessories visually. A small switch exists under the mouse as well, located by the optical sensor. We'll get into what it is and its function shortly. The Hyperclick also has a 6-foot cord, 2 feet longer than the originals. While this doesn't make much of a difference to people such as us who have always utilized mouse-based games close to a TV or monitor, people who would prefer to do so at more of a distance can do so more easily. And that's all there really is to the Hyperclick at a glance. There's not much to say that hasn't already been said packaging-wise, so let's dive into the Hyperclick's functionality. The Hyperclick is more or less exactly what you'd expect out of a primitive 2-button mouse. Moving the mouse around will move the cursor and supported software more or less at a 1-to-1 rate. Left and right buttons function just like the original mouse. Of course, a lack of a scroll wheel is to be expected as there has never been a game or application on the Super NES that supported such functionality. This also means that the Hyperclick is more or less outclassed by $2 mice at any dollar store if a player plans to adapt it to a USB converter to use on PC. I wanted to do it, but you know. But there is a neat feature hiding in plain sight on the Hyperclick, that small button on the bottom. Pressing it will toggle increased sensitivity on or off. This means that the mouse cursor will move further on screen with less distance covered on the mouse's surface. It doesn't work especially well for drawing in Mario Paint, and it often results in broken lines. But for apps like Dazemon when placing elements, or others like Nat Attack in Mario Paint where the cursor is used for targeting and shooting, the increased sensitivity works very well. As far as mice go, the Hyperclick adequately hits all of the points you'd want when it comes to smoothness and response. At first, input lag which was present in Mario Paint had us wondering whether there were latency issues, but it was present even with the original mouse. But in Dazemon there was none, so as far as response goes, there is zero difference between using the Hyperclick and the original. There is a bit of concern, however, regarding the tightness that the Hyperclick's controller connector has when inserting into the Super NES and Super Famicom, but it's not as bad as some would lead you to believe. Some connectors could vary through the manufacturing process, which realistically is the most likely scenario. Regardless, it does take a little more effort to insert and remove the Hyperclick from a Super NES or Super Famicom controller port, but it's not so hard that you're risking ripping out the wires or damaging your console. As such, the Hyperkin Hyperclick works brilliantly in all respects, to the point that we'd love to start tracking down more of the Super NES and Super Famicom games that support the mouse. Hopefully down the line, an optical mouse for the Sega Saturn could be produced too. Until then though, let's see how the Hyperclick stacks up. By contrast to many of Hyperkin's other products, the packaging to the Hyperclick is a little on the flimsy side, but it works for its intended purpose. It definitely feels as if it's meant to be thrown away when opened, rather than for storage. The Hyperclick has a satisfyingly large build with a good weight, a long cord, and responsive input. I would often reach for a scroll wheel that didn't exist, but that's a feature that wouldn't make sense in context. However, the tightness of the controller interface could be of slight concern. The Hyperclick mouse is all you'll find in the box here. Pretty straightforward, though a lack of instructions for the mouse seem to be an oversight, or maybe a mistake that affects a small percentage of packages. And in terms of function, having the ability to play Super NES and Super Famicom mouse games without having to worry about the rollerball getting gunked up is great. The mouse's variable sensitivity switch is also a fantastic feature. At just $20 US, you can find cheaper wireless optical mice for PC these days, but as a specialized piece of equipment for your retro gaming needs, it's an excellent price point. There may only be roughly 40 games worldwide that take advantage of the Super NES and Super Famicom mouse, but the Hyperclick brings a much-needed touch of modern tech to the retro landscape. For those games that support it, you'll never look back once you get the Hyperclick. We are absolutely going to look into finding and collecting Super NES mouse games going forward, thanks to how well the Hyperclick worked for us. Its good size, weight, and smooth operation, not to mention variable sensitivity, makes the Hyperclick the definitive Super NES mouse peripheral. The Hyperkin Hyperclick gets a 4.75 out of 5.